I'm going to start by talking about the Jesuits, probably the most significant religious movement, certainly to emerge out of the Catholic reform of the 16th century, but arguably the most influential religious movement to emerge out of the 16th century and 17th centuries. I want to talk a little bit about their origins, their spirituality, but also their crucial role in missionary work in the 16th and 17th centuries. The Jesuits as an order grow at an extraordinary pace. They're founded around Ignatius of Loyola in the 1540s, but already within 10 years there are thousands and thousands of Jesuits, and during, as I'll talk about in a few moments, during Loyola's own life, they are reaching Spain, what's modern-day Philippines, Africa, as we will talk about. From their base in Goa, which is in India, on the west coast of India. We'll talk on Wednesday primarily about the Jesuits in China. But today, very briefly, I want to talk about their origins, as I say, but also a little bit about their experiences in Africa, particularly Congo, the Kingdom of Congo, and as the reading is that you have for this week, Ethiopia. In both cases, I think you'd have to say very mixed results, particularly in Ethiopia, where the Jesuits end up being expelled in the 17th century. But nevertheless, I think we can see some interesting and significant ways in which Catholicism changes and some of the inner tensions within Catholicism that's raised by encounters with other cultures, which in the case certainly of Ethiopia, which has an ancient Christian tradition, and China, these cultures felt they had nothing to learn from the Jesuits. They had certainly no idea of a superior European Christianity. So the Jesuits, and I think this is one of the things that makes it a fascinating story, are engaging in, or are forced to engage in new ways of in their mission to spread, particularly Catholic, and in particular sort of Tridentine Council of Trent Catholicism. So as I say, these are the sort of themes. Some of the other themes that will emerge in this is the Jesuits, in some ways, as we saw in Americas with the Christian church, stands in a deeply problematic relationship because in many ways the Jesuits, like other missionaries, are dependent on colonialist trade and expansion. They travel on the mercantile ships. They're dependent on colonial governors, Portuguese particularly. At the same time, they are deeply critical of this. We'll talk about this more on Wednesday, but in Goa, deeply critical of colonialist rule. But then that's complicated when we get to the subject of slavery, where we find once more the Jesuits on both sides of the issue. So in many ways, I hope the Jesuits will be a way in which we can visit the complications of this world. Just as we've talked about Protestant narratives of the Reformation being this triumphalist movement, the Jesuits have long been part of a Catholic narrative of the kind of missionizing of the world, the spread of Catholicism through the world. Now, in many ways, that's right. We're seeing the kind of beginnings of Christianity as a global religion, taking on forms distinctly different from European Catholicism. So yes, we see encounters of Christians with cultures all over the world, but we're also going to see that it's hardly a triumphalist narrative. The origins, I really can only touch on this fairly briefly because it would be more than a talk in itself. But the origins of the Jesuit order, the Society of Jesus, really begins with the figure of Ignatius Loyola, a Spaniard, in many ways coming out of a somewhat similar background to Teresa, inheritor of a tradition, except Loyola was a soldier, wounded in battle, and while recovering from battle, takes up reading spiritual literature. And over the next period of time, he has a striking conversion, a series of visions. There is an autobiography, which is a fascinating read. It's written, actually, in many ways, it was dictated to his fellow Jesuits, which gives a detailed account of his life. Just as we, in a way, we have of Teresa, this role of biography and autobiography, spiritual biographies, which become an important form of literature in the 16th century, which unfortunately we won't have time to get into. But Ignatius belongs to this. But what he does, this is really cutting a long story short, but what he does in his travels is he goes to Paris, he wants to study at the university. He is what you would call a mature student. He's much older, but he wants to learn theology. He goes to Paris, and there begins to form a circle. But what attracts this circle of supporters and friends is Ignatius's working out of a text called the Spiritual Exercises, for which he is probably most famous. The Spiritual Exercises are precisely that. It is a rigorous program. Program sounds an ugly word, but it is a spiritual guide towards an interiority that manifests itself in the world. Think of this a little bit as akin to Teresa, who was influenced by Loyola. This idea that inward transformation, the mystical experience, manifests itself in the world, and that will become a central part of Jesuit spirituality. Very much world-embracing, but through the lens of a transformed interiority. The Jesuits travel through Venice. They make this small band of characters around Loyola. They make their way ultimately to Rome, where they are made an official order of the church. Now, there's something quite distinctive about this new order, the Society of Jesus, because in addition of poverty, chastity, and obedience, the Jesuits will take a fourth vow of loyalty to the papacy. And that's going to be crucial, because it means that the Jesuits are not under the control of any local figure. They're not parish clergy, as we would call them. They're not under the authority of the bishop. They are directly under the authority of the papacy. Like many of his generation, Loyola's goal is to go to Jerusalem. The liberation of Jerusalem from Islam. And coming out of that Spanish mentality that we talked about before, he has, and being of a military background, there is a kind of crusading nature to Loyola. But that's not the totality of his character. He's also a deep, I think it's in the course that I teach with Professor Lepine on mysticism, we're going to be reading Loyola. He also stands in that tradition of mysticism. He's a deeply charismatic figure. He's almost exactly a contemporary, in a sense, of John Calvin, in that they were in Paris at the same time. And often comparisons are drawn between the two. This idea of an inward transformation of the person, of the soul, as a means of transforming the world. So there's something, you don't want to overdraw this, but it's been recognized that there's something similar in a kind of spirituality between the two. Here is just a famous painting by Peter Paul Rubens of the early 17th century. There's a series of them. These were altarpieces. And this is Ignatius of Loyola performing miracles. And here you see the woman. He's driving out demons. Here you see the man and the woman. The demons are being cast out. And here you see in the background these figures. I'm sorry, it's not very good in this light. But these figures in black representing the church, so that the point is being made that Loyola's driving out of the demons, his exorcism, has the full support of the church. Remember, we had that issue with Teresa was also seen as an exorcist, but that put her in a very liminal position in the church as a woman. Here we see the affirmation of Loyola as a performing the miracles of the miracles within the context of the church, because you can also see the framework. It's within the church. So the point is being made very, very clearly. Very briefly, the spiritual exercises, in some ways, it's not really a great work to read. I know many of you will be familiar with them. It reads somewhat like a book of instructions. It's not like reading Teresa or Ignatius's spiritual autobiography. It's a guide to the transformation of the soul. Famously, it's divided into 4 weeks. Ignatius's central idea, and it's really the central idea of the Jesuits, and that is the reform of the will. That the will is not only one with God, but one with the church. Because very important to Ignatius and to the Jesuits is their devotion to the institutional church. Remember, they're under the authority of the papacy. So although, as we will talk about in a few moments, they travel all over the place, and often, usually only in pairs, their devotion is to the church. Their emphasis is on the formation of the will to unity with Christ, unity with the church. Come to this in a moment. Ignatius refers to it as thinking with the church. So this is part of that Tridentine Council of Trent idea that we were talking about last week, is the church as the Catholic body of Christ, the worldwide body of Christ, with a missionary disposition. The Jesuits, in many ways, manifest that attitude. Just as a matter of interest, how many people here have been through the Ignatian spiritual exercises? So, okay, Andy, you've done it. Give us a very brief impression of what it's like.
It's a lot like being turned inside out, spiritually. Yeah, it's really hard work and really transformative. I mean, I wasn't doing them as a Jesuit, so.
No.
But yeah, it's serious.
Yeah. Anyone else have any experiences with them? They are, as Andy says, to say they're extremely hard work is accurate, but it makes it sound like it's a kind of labor that's imposed on you. It's a process of disciplining mind and body. And you do it through meditation on Scripture and the repetition of prayer. It's based on the old spiritual practice of meditation and contemplation. And you progress through the weeks. But it's not weeks like we think of as 7 days. It's not as mundane as that. It's weeks, and remember that how Teresa talked about the 4 rivers. It's stages of enlightenment, if you want to put it that way, stages of pure spiritual progress. And Ignatius, it exists, I take it, Andy, you probably had a spiritual director. Yeah. So it exists in a kind of intimate relationship between a spiritual director and the person. And it's very important that there be a spiritual director, that you're not doing this on your own. And that's one of the reasons why Ignatius became very popular, is that he was seen as a kind of wonderful spiritual director. And that's what the Jesuits were doing. And they won a great deal of support, particularly amongst women who were drawn to this, women in prominent positions who became patrons of the Jesuits. This spiritual renewal became extremely attractive to many people, and that won the Jesuits a lot of followers, particularly amongst influential people. And that's a practice we're going to see when we talk about Africa and China. That's part of the method of the Jesuits, is that you make contact with the influential people as a way of gaining access into the broader society. This is what Ignatius is doing right from the beginning, but it's this intimate relationship between a spiritual director and the person who guides them through these meditations. Meditations on heaven and hell, and not in simply an intellective manner, but in a manner in which the whole person is drawn together. So, and some of you will, I'm sure, will be very familiar to this with meditative practices from other traditions and other places. An extremely intense use of the Bible. Ignatius writes how you should place yourself into the biblical scene. You should smell the straw. You should smell the odor of birth. You should smell the breath of the animals. Likewise, and we have this in Teresa, we certainly have it in John of the Cross, who we briefly mentioned last week, that you have this, that you are present at the Passion. And not just in terms of images or sort of imagination, although imagination is an important word, but that you are in your whole person present in this biblical scene. And that's and that you're meditating on it, every aspect of it, in its both physical and spiritual forms. For most people, and this was perfectly fine, might progress only through the first week or the second week. That was absolutely fine. Those who became Jesuits would be expected to pass to complete the whole period of 4 weeks. The mentality of the Jesuits is very much shaped around their famous motto, Ad Mariam Dei Gloriam, for the greater glory of God. And that's what they saw themselves as committed to. And that commitment was one of a life of deprivation. Jesuits were itinerant. They moved around. They did not, although there are some exceptions, but they did not settle in parish churches. They did not become, for the most part, they did not have religious houses because they were constantly on the move. And Ignatius said that they should never be alone, but they should go in pairs. So that when we talk about the Jesuits in Congo or Ethiopia, as you're going to see, we're actually talking about a very small number of people. That's also true when we talk about Matteo Ricci in China. It's not like there's a vast number of them going into these places, they operate in very small numbers, but always at least as a pair. The Jesuits, and here's also another point of contact that's made with Calvinists, place a huge emphasis on education. Education had been crucial for Loyola, but education as a means of transforming the individual and the community. And the Jesuits become the great educators of Catholic Europe in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. Some of the most famous people that we will talk about and we will not have time to talk about, such as Galileo or Descartes, the philosopher René Descartes. One of the things they all had in common is that they were educated by the Jesuits. And the Jesuits they set up schools across Europe, and they set up schools as a crucial part of their missions. Education, they saw, was the key. Not only to conversion, but to the building of a Christian society and the building of a Catholic society. And through this, the emphasis on education in catechisms, instruction, in preaching. But they also place a lot of emphasis on works of charity. That's how they gained their part of the way they gained their reputation in the first place. Loyola and his group went to Venice, and they were involved in working with plague victims in places that other people simply wouldn't go. And they won this reputation for compassion and Christian charity. Just very briefly, I've talked about Ignatius, but one of the other crucial figures I'll talk more about on Wednesday is Francis Xavier, a name that's probably familiar to many people. But just to give you a sense of their growth, is that a small company, by 1600, they've grown by thousands, and you can see they already have 500 schools. Before Ignatius even dies, there are Jesuits, as you see here, in Congo, Brazil, India, Ethiopia, and what's modern day in Indonesia. Not huge numbers, as we talked about, but in small numbers, but traveling through the world. One of the themes of the Jesuits, and this is one that will be highly controversial, we'll see that more on Wednesday when we talk about China and the famous story of Matteo Ricci. But one of the things that comes from Ignatius himself is this belief in accommodation. What does he mean by accommodation? Accommodation means that you should adapt yourself to those with whom you are engaging. That the process of conversion requires, and this goes right back to the spiritual director and the exercises. The spiritual director must adapt themselves to the needs of the person who is being directed. Not to be too strong, not to go too fast, but to get inside their spiritual world and be able to guide them. Well, that becomes a principle of Jesuit missions. And it takes the form, this is where it starts to get very controversial, of entering into other cultures. Dress, learning the language, taking up ancient customs and adapting them to Christianity, or you could say adapting Christianity to them, depending on how you looked at it. That was part of the controversy. How, of course, do you bring Christian ideas into other languages? What words are you going to use for Trinity? A whole range of this. What words are you going to use for God? What does Son of God mean in other languages? What will it mean in Chinese, which has, of course, no Christian language or vocabulary? So this is where the Jesuits see themselves as engaging with cultures in a new way. We've seen traces of it before, but it's the Jesuits who really push this idea of accommodation as essential to missionary work. The charge that's going to be against them, of course, is that they have, at best, diluted the Catholic faith, and at worst, corrupted it. And that will be one of the major controversies we'll talk about on Wednesday in particular. Ignatius, while he was alive, was fascinated with Africa. He didn't know much about it, but there had already been considerable contact with Africa, particularly as we talked about the Portuguese, who, according to the treaty that we talked about of 1494, were given access to Africa, whereas the Americas in the East largely fell to the Spanish. From his background in Spain, Ignatius knew a number of Africans who had come from the northern part, as they say here, Morocco. But that fascination also grew because of the particular idea of Congo. We'll come to that story just in a second. But the Congo actually, at least officially, converts to Christianity at a very early age, by the end of the 15th century. So there's already a base of Christianity on the West Coast. But we should not overemphasize this. Loyola has this sense of both Africa and Asia, which is extremely vague and based on sort of anecdotal reports. But he's convinced that it is the calling of the Jesuits to go there. This is just information that we've covered already. But let's just get a sense of the period. I'm going to talk briefly about the Kingdom of Congo here, and then briefly about Angola, the modern state of Angola, which is here, and then briefly also about the Christian kingdom of Ethiopia in the east. There's obviously so much more that can be covered. I'm just going to touch on them as part of our story. Here you see a slightly larger image of Congo with Angola, which is a crucial part of the story because Angola is a major source of enslaved people. And that's where the Jesuits are both involved and acting in opposition in that complex relationship. So you see, by 1491, the Congo kingdom has already, at least in part, the elites embraced Christianity. So there is at least something of a structure in the church when the Jesuits arrive. The Congo kingdom and Portugal have fairly close relations based on trade. And you can see that King Alfonso established Christianity in Congo, that there are a series of missions before the Jesuits go there. But what's really remarkable is that Alfonso's son, Alfonso of course is the European name, his son Enrique is made bishop in the Congo and actually comes to Europe to study. So there is these images, and yet you see here a European representation of the Congo king. So the Jesuits, I'm having to sort of jump forward fairly quickly. There's a really good book on this, which I meant to put on the PowerPoint, but I'll send around in a note, which was actually done by a Yale person, which is very much an art history book, but quite fascinating on the subject. You see that they arrive in 1548. What's remarkable about that is that the Jesuits have only been formed in the very early 1540s. So this is within years of the formation of the order. And within a decade, they're already moving in small numbers, just to make that point again, but moving through Portuguese trade routes and making contacts. And already by 1556, there is a Catholic catechism that's been translated. But they also are committed to, this is where it starts to get very complicated, they're committed to the ideals of the Council of Trent, but become very quickly aware that those ideals can only be literally translated into the culture by a series of significant adaptations, or one could say a sort of way of reformulations, particularly as they try to find both ritual and linguistic forms. So the Jesuits are very much at the forefront of this. They're writing school books, they're writing catechisms. They seek to learn the languages, and we know from reports, often very imperfectly, but nevertheless seek to find ways to express Catholic doctrine. But what's also significant is that they begin from an early stage in the education of Congolese clergy, so that there are, from a fairly early stage after the Jesuits arrive, ordained Congolese clergy who become an essential part of the missionary activity. So here, I've made this point, but I've just in slightly more detail. You see that there becomes the origins of a slightly distinctive manifestations of what we call theology, based on the Jesuit experiences of education, missionary work, preaching, catechism. The Jesuits see that the essential way in which this is going to happen is by access both to languages, but also to traditional customs. The issue of slavery, of course, is crucial, because for a long time before the Jesuits have arrived, Congo, and in particular, what is modern-day Angola, which was at that point the Kingdom of Angola, where the Jesuits only had limited access, were crucial to the Portuguese slave trade. What I want to say here is really that the Jesuits' record here is very mixed. We have voices being raised against the enslavement, but we also have examples of where Jesuits themselves owned slaves. So there's no one position on this. The Jesuits existed continuously in a very problematic relationship with the Portuguese rulers and traders, but there is no doubt that they participated in the enslavement of Africans, particularly out of Angola. Going to have to make a quick pivot here to just because I want to bring up another fascinating situation, which is somewhat contrasting, because whereas the Kingdom of Congo, from the end of the 15th century, has at least some Christian structure, Ethiopia in the east has a very ancient tradition of Christianity. As you can see, that it traces itself, its connections to the Bible, right back to Menelik, the son of Solomon, and the Queen of Sheba. Ethiopian Christianity developed its distinctive character, but was long associated with Alexandria. And two, I think, crucial elements to identify here is both it rejected Chalcedonian Christianity on the nature of Christ. It was known in the West as a Monophysite church, following the tradition of Alexandria. And it also had a strong attachment to Semitic practices. At the heart of it was this was the story that the Ark of the Covenant was brought to Ethiopia. It's still believed to be there, seen only by priests. But Ethiopian Christianity retained many of the practices of the Hebrew Bible, of the Israelite people. And that's true very much until today. In the European imagination, Ethiopia was very much an exotic other. It was closely associated with the medieval and very strong late medieval tradition of Prester John, a legend of a Christian monarch divinely appointed in the East who was struggling against Islam. I'll show you in a minute a couple of visual presentations. This myth, which runs strongly, is this Prester John is seen in apocalyptic terms. But Portugal also had some connections to Ethiopia prior to the Jesuits. At the request of one of the Ethiopian emperors, as a defense against Islam, Portuguese troops were sent to the country. So there was a connection. There is also a context, I mentioned this before, that some representatives of the Ethiopian Church came to the Council of Trent. The story of the Jesuit missions to Ethiopia is one of limited success and ultimate failure. As you can see, by 1632, it runs only for about less than a century, approximately 80 years. But within that, there are phases of success and expulsion. Finally, in 1632, they are expelled from the country. Here is the image of where Prester John was imagined to be. So you can see it's in the Horn of Africa. This was thought to be where he dwelt. Here we see an image of Prester John from the late 15th century. This sort of priest-king, Christ-like figure. So that Ethiopia loomed large in the Jesuit imagination. One of the things that's remarkable about the Jesuits and their missions is that they were required to send back detailed correspondence of their missions. So that in Rome, and this is a gold mine for historians now, in Rome there is this enormous collection of correspondence from those who traveled all over the world, with detailed accounts of what they found, of what they encountered, of the languages, of the culture. It's a kind of early modern ethnography. So that the Jesuits formed this almost global network of communication, which was transformative in European imagination of the world. It brought information into the world, into that world, which was simply, revolutionarily new. And that's going to tie in a little bit with what we're going to talk about after we come back with the growth of science. This is a period of an explosion of knowledge. And the Jesuits are central to that explosion of knowledge. Ignatius knew about Ethiopia from the earliest Jesuit missions, from the Portuguese, and he was fascinated by it. But what the Jesuits were being called to do, above all else, was to convert the ancient Christianity of Ethiopia away from monophysitism and its dependence on Alexandria towards Roman Catholicism. That's what if we want a kind of essence of what the Jesuits were trying to do, it was to convert Ethiopian Christianity to Catholicism. And I have a quote here, quotation, I always have to remember to say, a quotation here from Loyola's own letter to the Ethiopian emperor. There is only one Catholic church in the world, and it can only be under the one Roman pontiff and not under the one of Alexandria. That's a whole debate we don't have to go into. If anyone wants to read more about the fascinating story of Ethiopian Christianity in the early modern period, I'm happy to make some suggestions. Just a few maps. Here we see what is more or less modern-day Ethiopia, Addis Ababa, the capital in the center, the very contested area right up to today, of course, of Eritrea and Somalia, and the independent country of Djibouti, right? And this is the area which, of course, is infamous these days for being very dangerous with piracy. Here you get most of what was the Kingdom of Ethiopia Christian part was here in the north. Here you see some of the crucial centers of Ethiopian Christianity. Just to give you a sense of the geographic imagination of Ethiopia by the 1580s, here you see the Ortelius map of what they imagined Africa to look like. That's another story I want to come back to. But I want to say a couple of things in the last 5 minutes or so. The Jesuits sought to employ their traditional methods in Ethiopia of trying to convert the elites as a method of converting the whole country. And they had some limited success. At one point, they are able to convert the Ethiopian emperor to Christianity, or to Roman Catholicism. But that victory proves very brief because he is defeated in battle. There is civil war. Much of the Jesuit missions is taking place against the background of civil war in the land. The Jesuits are seen by many as outsiders. There is tremendous resistance to Catholicism as an affront to the historic Christianity of the empire. The Jesuits do succeed in establishing a series of missions, but we're really talking up here about between 20 and 30 people. This is a small group of people who are doing this. I've put on the PowerPoint some of the more details of the story, but I want to make just a couple of points. First of all, the missions are not for the whole highly successful. By 1563, you can see that there was great hostility, and many of the Jesuits were actually imprisoned. Some of them were killed. The major figure in this is Pedro Pius, and he becomes the leading Jesuit figure in Ethiopia. He is responsible for the limited amount of success that there is, translation of the Catechism into Ge'ez, the language, and he is the one who is able to make the best impression on the Ethiopian rulers. Following him, there is again some success, which is then followed by reversal. So it's a story of kind of ebb and flow with no particular sense that the empire is actually going to convert. Here, it's just an image of some of the central Jesuit missions. You can see they're relatively closely gathered together. What I want to say in the last couple of minutes is something about the source. We'll just jump forward. The source that you're looking at, a portion of. In addition to their extensive correspondence, the Jesuits employed historical writing. They were great historians. And those historians, those historical works, like Lobo, who you're looking at least a portion of his text, I wanted you to see that, to get a sense of how they try to describe everything that they see. This is part of the historical method that is emerging in the 16th century, which places less of an emphasis on the kind of biblical providential story and much more on the observation of the world around you. This is something that will be important for science in a couple of weeks. This emphasis on empirical observation. And that's why I want you to get a sense of this from the Chronicle. And when you look at it, to think about in what ways is the Jesuit mentality shaping what they see? And in what ways, perhaps, is it being shaped by those events? But the Jesuits become, in a way, the kind of journalists of the 16th century, sending back vast amounts of information. But of course, it's not unbiased. It's based on their missionary attitudes. So one of the things I think will be interesting for you looking at Lobo is to see how this European perspective of the 16th century is trying as emphatically as it can to understand the culture in which it's observing.